Here's what you say. As they stand, prisons and jails are detrimental to public health and human rights and disproportionately harm marginalized communities, including Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other communities of color, immigrants, people with mental illness, people with disabilities, people in the LGBTQ plus community, people who use drugs, people engaged in sex work and street economies, and people experiencing houselessness and poverty. So if you believe that about our prisons, how are you going to ever sentence somebody to prison?
So, Senator, I will need to take a look at that letter, and I apologize that that's not something I found to hand to this committee.
You're not denying you said that.
Wow, that exchange was something else. Senator John Kennedy didn't just ask questions in that hearing. Senator John Kennedy exposed contradictions, evasions, and a very uncomfortable paper trail. This wasn't about theatrics. This was about accountability. What stood out immediately is how methodical Senator John Kennedy was. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult anyone. He simply read exact words from a letter and asked one basic question over and over again. If this is what you believe, how can you be trusted with judicial power? And somehow, that question never got a straight answer. This is exactly why hearings like this matter. If you value transparency, consistency, and real scrutiny of judicial nominees, you're in the right place. This is Congress Lens. I'm Audrey. If you want clear-eyed reactions to what really happens in Congress, hit subscribe, like this video, and let's get into it.
I just feel like I need to ask this question. Mr. Fonzone, when you advised the companies referenced, Huawei and others, you were at Sidley?
Yes, that's right, sir.
And when a client comes to Sidley, you have to fill out a form that says, here's my client name, here's my mailing address for business purposes, and here are my political beliefs. Is that the way it works?
There's definitely a client intake process. I don't remember all the particulars of it.
I mean, big law kind of like who can pay the freight, right?
That's an aspect of the intake process, I'm sure.
I understand. Professor, I'm looking at a letter dated March 16, 2020. It's a letter to Governor Lamont in Connecticut. The title of it is Urgent Action Needed to Protect Individuals in Connecticut's Prisons and Jails from Coronavirus 19 Pandemic. Did you sign that letter?
So I don't recall sitting here today, Senator.
Here's your signature. Here it is back here. Why didn't you turn this over to us when you were asked to submit documents?
So, Senator, I made every effort to search for everything that I had ever signed. That's not a letter I remember, but I will certainly take a look at that. And
well, we found it was with a search on the internet.
So I apologize, Senator. I apologize.
In your letter to the governor, here's what you say. As they stand, prisons and jails are detrimental to public health and human rights and disproportionately harm marginalized communities, including Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other communities of color, immigrants, people with mental illness, people with disabilities, people in the LGBTQ plus community, people who use drugs, people engaged in sex work and street economies, and people experiencing houselessness and poverty. So if you believe that about our prisons, how are you going to ever sentence somebody to prison?
So, Senator, I will need to take a look at that letter, and I apologize that that's not something I found to hand to this committee.
You're not denying you said that.
I do need to see the letter to see the context, because, again, it's not something I remember adding my name to. Yeah. I can assure you, right. Senator.
And you also say, first, you call on Governor Lamont to release everybody in jail. Is that right? Because of the coronavirus?
So again, Senator, I would need to see that letter in front of me. It certainly was not.
You can find it with, just put your name into Google. You'll find it in about 3 nanoseconds.
I will, Senator. I can assure you that
You said in your letter, Professor, we call on Governor Lamont, state of Connecticut, and all Connecticut jurisdictions to immediate release to the maximum extent possible people incarcerated pre-trial and post-conviction. And then you go on to say, talking once again about our jails, the global COVID-19 pandemic is throwing into sharp relief the untenable state of our penal system and the need for sustained action to shrink its scale, shrink its size, and shrink its scope. You sound here like the district attorney in San Francisco. If you believe that, how are you going to ever sentence anybody to jail, Professor?
I can assure you, Senator, that I understand the role of the judge and that I can assure you prison time is an appropriate sentence in
That's
many
not what
cases.
you say here to the governor. You wrote the governor. This isn't some DoorDash delivery guy. You wrote the governor of your state 3 years ago.
So again, Senator,
you were in law school.
So again, Senator, I would need to look at the letter. It sounds like it was written at the height of the pandemic where governors were looking for.
You also wrote the governor, you said, people over the age of 55 are at the greatest risk for COVID-19, but also pose the least public safety risk to our communities. People in this age group can and should be released immediately to mitigate the spread of COVID-19. You think the governor just, if you're over the age of 55, he should have let everybody go?
No, Senator, that's not a position.
That's what you said.
Okay.
Here it is, biggest house.
Again, Senator, I will look at that letter. I can assure you that.
Find it on Google, Professor. You also say Governor Lamont should issue an executive order to direct the state's attorney offices and law enforcement entities, including the town and city police departments, and any federal law enforcement entity operating within the state to immediately cease adding to the incarcerated prison population given the high risk of infection posed by the population increase. You asked the governors to tell every law enforcement official in the state to stop arresting people and putting them in jail, didn't you?
So again, Senator, I have to look at that letter. I do think there were modifications that the governors were making around the country to respond to the pandemic.
You also had an opinion in your letter about, can I have another 30 seconds, Mr. You had an opinion in your letter about immigration. You said immigration detention poses the same health risk to jails and prisons, and Connecticut law enforcement must stop feeding people into the unsafe and inhumane immigration detention system. Then you say Governor Lamont should release all individuals currently in state custody who are waiting transfer to ICE custody, and the governor should declare a moratorium on all such future transfers. How, if somebody is in our country illegally and commits a crime, are you going to put them in jail if you believe this about immigration?
Senator, I can assure you, were I so fortunate to be confirmed, I would treat crimes seriously.
That's not what this letter says, Professor, and it was 3 years ago. It wasn't when you were in law school, and you didn't turn it over to us. We had to find it on our own.
Senator, the chair has been generous in time. I think you've had.
All right, now that we've watched the full exchange, let's break this down. Because Senator John Kennedy was doing far more than grilling a nominee. He was holding the nominee to their own words. First, the biggest issue here wasn't even the letter itself. The real red flag was denial and non-disclosure. Senator John Kennedy presented a 2020 letter signed by Mr. Fonzone calling for the mass release of prisoners, a halt to arrests, and even a pause on immigration detention. This wasn't hearsay. This wasn't rumor. This was a signed public letter addressed directly to the governor of Connecticut. And yet, Mr. Fonzone repeatedly claimed he didn't remember signing it, and more troubling, he didn't disclose it to the committee at all. Let's be very clear. This committee didn't dig it up through some back channel. Senator John Kennedy found it with a basic internet search. That alone raises serious questions about thoroughness, candor, and honesty during the vetting process. Second, Senator John Kennedy zeroed in on judicial philosophy, not politics. When Mr. Fonzone's letter described prisons and jails as detrimental to public health and human rights, Senator John Kennedy asked the most reasonable follow-up imaginable. If you truly believe prisons are fundamentally harmful, how can you fairly sentence someone to prison as a judge? That's not a trick question. That's a core issue of judicial responsibility. And what did we get in response? Repeated deflections. I'd need to see the letter. I don't recall the context. That was during the pandemic. Context does not erase content. Third, the COVID argument doesn't save the nominee here. Yes, 2020 was chaotic. Yes, governors were making emergency decisions. But this letter went far beyond temporary health measures. It called for shrinking the penal system permanently, releasing inmates en masse, stopping arrests, and even blocking immigration transfers to IC. That's not a narrow public health recommendation. That's an ideological position. Senator John Kennedy was absolutely right to point out that these weren't casual remarks or a class discussion in law school. This was a formal appeal to executive power, signed and sent to a sitting governor. Fourth, the immigration portion of the letter was especially revealing. The letter argued that immigration detention should essentially stop and that people awaiting ICE transfer should be released. Senator John Kennedy then asked another straightforward question. If someone is in the country illegally and commits a crime, are you going to put them in jail? Again, silence, sidestepping, and assurances that directly contradicted the written record. This is why Senator John Kennedy kept saying, "That's what you said." Not what someone interpreted, not what someone accused, what the nominee actually wrote. And finally, here's the key takeaway. Senator John Kennedy didn't accuse. He didn't speculate. He didn't exaggerate. He simply held up the nominee's own words and asked whether those words align with the responsibilities of a federal judge. That is oversight done right. Judges wield enormous power over liberty, sentencing, and public safety. If a nominee's past advocacy suggests hostility toward incarceration itself, the Senate has every right and obligation to examine that closely. This wasn't bullying. This wasn't grandstanding. This was scrutiny. And Senator John Kennedy did exactly what voters expect. Read the record, confront contradictions, and demand clarity, even when the answers are uncomfortable. That's how accountability works.